from the American Academy of Pediatrics.
The 2023 National Conference and Exhibition ended on October 24th, and we're still unpacking both our suitcases and our memories. For our listeners, though, this doesn't mean the conference is over.
That's right, David. You can still sign up to access the amazing content virtually, and there are so many presentations that were recorded and so many slides online for you to view and learn from.
I learned a ton that will change my practice, and I know you did too, Joanna, so let's review our favorite sessions in this special episode of Pediatrics on Call, the podcast on children's health from the AAP. I'm Dr. David Hill.
And I'm Dr. Joanna Parga-Belinkie. This podcast is for everyone in the medical community, keeping our children healthy and safe.
It's a show by pediatricians for pediatricians.
But anyone who cares about kids will get a lot out of it as well.
Let's get right to our discussion about the best of the 2023 National Conference and Exhibition. I want to start with the fact that around 15,000 participants were there. A lot of pediatricians, but so many others, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, including my wife, Christy, and advocates, a large group of people invested in children's health and well-being.
It was a phenomenal crowd. There is such a value in gathering with passionate people who truly want to make the world a better place for our children. It filled my cup, David, and I learned so much and feel so energized to bring what I learned back to the clinical work I do in Philadelphia.
Well, we could go on and on about the conference, particularly the advocacy tree and each beautiful bloom that pediatricians wrote and are working to change, and how the exhibit hall was filled with innovation, celebration, and collaboration. But we have only 30 minutes here, so let's get to the talks.
Okay, let's start with the plenary sessions because, well, they took center stage for us, and they were all jaw-dropping. So, David, I had to do some deep soul searching, and I know you did too, but we're only allowed to do our top 3. Do you mind if I start, David?
I wish you would.
All right. One of the most influential talks for me was Dr. Ayla Stanford. I have been following Dr. Stanford's career closely because she's a Philadelphian like me, and I was well aware of her work with forming and leading the Black Doctors Consortium during COVID-19. But it was something else to hear her talk about it. She made it so clear that doctors need to know the communities they serve and that representation matters in medicine. That and actually being in and going to the communities you want to treat so they don't have to come to you, it was very, very inspiring.
I loved that. And speaking of familiar places, I have to start with Dr. Sandra McKay, who works both at the UT Health Science Center in Houston and at Rice University. She addressed one of my favorite topics, how to have life-saving conversations with people who may see things differently, in this case, Texas gun owners. Now, Sandra and I both grew up shooting guns, and her research with gun owners shows that talking about these weapons as tools like a skill saw or a hot stove really resonated when advocating for safe storage. My favorite tip, ask why a parent of a young child would ever store a gun in a place they wouldn't leave a permanent marker.
That's just a really interesting juxtaposition, David. It puts it into such context for you.
I know, right?
And so the next person I wanted to mention was Katie Watson. She's a lawyer in Chicago, known for work in medical bioethics and the author of Scarlet A, The Ethics, Law, and Politics of Ordinary Abortion. And that's what she came to talk about, how it affects families and how we as pediatricians should be advocates for reproductive health. And she told this kind of also a little bit comical, opening story of a mom who was pregnant on a plane and she was throwing up and she had a young child who had pooped through their diaper. She called it the Mount Vesuvius poop, which I think a lot of parents know. And she was struggling to get off the plane. You see it with the stroller. And there was this man and he passed her and instead of helping her, he just kind of blessed her.
Yes.
And it just so encapsulated, I think, the struggle women have in this country when they really need to be offered a hand and things need to change. And it was just a really interesting talk about women and abortion and how many women who have had abortions have other children or go on to have other children. and that it's as much a personal choice as it is about family planning and the financial reasons that go into having a child and how it both affects a woman to be pregnant, both physically and emotionally. And I just thought she did such a really good job humanizing, but also making people realize that abortion is a medical procedure and maybe should be treated like other medical procedures, even though it has its own nuances, but kind of every medical procedure does. And so I really recommend going back and listening to her talk. And I think she's a really good advocate for reproductive health. And so she's someone that now her book is on my list to read.
I know she was really inspiring, and she really placed abortion in a pro-family sort of context about women being able to raise the kinds of families that they want to, that they feel competent to and have the support for. So I really appreciated that.
Yeah.
All right. I have to give a shout out to our very first plenary keynote speaker, Valerie Burton. She's a personal coach and a motivational speaker, and her message resonated with me at this moment where I'm having to reassess my future in leadership and also my career path in pediatrics. When I say it, it's going to sound so cliche, but she offered some really concrete strategies for embracing events that may seem like defeats or setbacks and reframing them as exciting opportunities. And I have to say, that's exactly where I am right now. And especially after Valerie's talk, I am so excited to have this moment to choose new goals and new paths to attain them.
And I'm excited to see where you go, David. I think there's so much possibility.
As long as it keeps the podcast, we're all good.
And I was going to mention the last speaker. I know you mentioned the first plenary speaker, Tracy Hall. She's a librarian, and she went into this discussion about banned books. And it was interesting because she did mention books that were banned, and I mentioned this on stage too, but I have Everyone Poops, which is a book that she mentioned is banned in some communities. And she said, and while it's important to know which books are banned in certain communities, I think she really went into this why, so the reasons behind it. And I was surprised because she also talked about how a lot of people who want to ban certain books haven't actually read them and taken them in. And she also went into literacy in this country and who can read. And I guess, and it really helped me understand how big an issue this was too, because she talked about it in a historical context. She called it the McCarthy era on steroids with banning books. And it just really touched me too, because I think not everybody's going to want to read these books that are banned, right? But like just having the option and knowing that there are books about situations you might be in that are going to help normalize that situation for you and make sure you're not alone. And, you know, she was talking about how many authors now are going to these meetings where their books are getting banned to kind of talk about that and give voice to their books. And so I'm just really hoping that she's going to help us as a country move the needle on keeping ideas flowing and free and books on the shelves where they need to be for both adults and kids to read.
Yeah, I loved how Tracy Hall framed the availability of the written word as an equity issue and really pointed out that it is a very suburban issue, but also a rural and an urban issue. There's nobody who's not affected. And when the availability of information gets limited, I think, we're all harmed.
Yeah.
All right. I want to end our plenary discussion on a high note. Actually, on a whole lot of notes played for us by the talented young blind pianist Jose Andre. As a former wannabe jazz pianist myself, I stood in awe listening to this young man whose father helped him onto the piano bench from his wheelchair as he filled the hall with chords and arpeggios, Joanna, I could never dream of on my best day.
Yeah.
It was a transporting performance, and for me, it's reason enough to sign into the conference platform and watch the plenaries, ideally with some really good headphones on.
And I love the plenaries when they showcase young artists like him who are so talented and how, children can transport you. It was really amazing to listen to him and to see him with his family and to hear him too. He was such like a positive person.
Yeah.
And, we can speak about the incredible plenary sessions, but we want to get to some of the many educational sessions that we went to as well. And so we challenged ourselves again to only highlight a certain amount, to only highlight 5. So is it okay, again, if I start, David? Because I have 2 that kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, let's
my
hear
experience
those.
at the concert. Or not at the concert, at the conference. I was still thinking about it.
It was a little of both.
Yeah. I think I want to go to a piano concert.
Everybody also sang to each other, so it very much was a concert.
That's true. We all have to stand by each other. So part of the conference for me, it was actually the first time that I have been on the executive board for the Council on Communications and Media. And so I went to a lot of their talks. And the acronym's COCOM, right?
Yeah, that's what we call ourselves, COCOM.
Yeah, for a while I was saying HOCOM, which is a
the
medical
COCOM
condition,
nuts.
not the name of it. So I'm starting to get in this community. I wanted to go to a lot of the talks. One of the talks I went to was Dr. Edith Bracho Sanchez. She's from Columbia University in New York City, and hers was about pitching ideas to mainstream media. And I really loved it because she really broke down how she does pitches and shared her own personal experience about pitching to the media. She talked about what makes something newsworthy, the impact of it, the proximity to it, the timeliness, how prominent it is, if it's a human interest story or sometimes if it's novel. And then she went into the components of how she wrote a pitch. So a sentence summary, the why now, the main points, and also solutions, which she felt were really important to people producing media. She talked a little bit about social media too, but also likened it to maybe building on quicksand, which is a quote of hers that I kind of liked because that landscape changes so frequently, and sort of the importance in plugging into some mainstream media too, if you're someone who enjoys media. And then I also got to hear Dr. Corey Cross, who has an affiliation at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, and she talked about screen time and beyond, what we know and how to help empower parents. And she specifically went into what moms and dads can do to make a difference with screen time. So it was just like a really fun, practical talk,
Yes.
about media and family. She really emphasized the family media plan that the Center of Excellence, which has kind of partnered with the AAP, has made. And I encourage everyone to actually go look at the family media plan. It's very extensive, so you need some time to do it, but it has such great thoughts about talking to your kids about media and understanding what they're using and how to regulate use and put guardrails around it. And just one really funny thing that Dr. Cross said was that, now kids are used to getting information really easily and going online for that. And the idea that you have to help them Google and help them understand what they're going to find in searches kind of really stuck with me. So that was just a really great, and again, practical, if you're a pediatrician or a parent, talk to go listen to.
I love that. I will tell you, I was in the room when Corey Cross pitched the idea of the family media plan, and it was almost an afterthought. This is in preparation for our 2016 policy statements, and it has become one of the deliverables that the Council on Communications and Media is most proud of appropriately. It's such a great tool. Joanna, I'm going to piggyback on your comments by referencing another speaker from that same COCMH session, Dr. Megan Moreno. Her talk on the relationship between social media use and youth mental health held more interest for me than just hearing a longtime friend and colleague present. I give a version of that same talk. And Megan has always been kind enough to share her hard-won expertise with me as a pioneering researcher in the field. And to quote Inigo Montoya, "Let me explain. There is no time. Let me sum up." And to quote Nancy Meyer's 2009 romantic comedy with Meryl Streep, "It's complicated." In addition to checking out that talk in the conference app, I encourage pediatricians to visit the new AAP Center of Excellence on Social Media and Youth Mental Health, which you just mentioned, which is headed by Dr. Moreno and COCM Chair Dr. Jenny Radesky.
Everyone should definitely go check that out. It's so informative and it has so much information in this area. But we don't want to keep it all in the media sphere. There were so many other things that were valuable pearls. And I love breastfeeding David, because I'm also an IBCLC. I'm about to try to breastfeed my third when they come. So I went to a talk by Dr. Jennifer Thomas, also an IBCLC, and it was called Fourth Trimester Care, Balancing Breastfeeding on Demand and Sleep Training. So you could tell why I went, David. It's very topical for me. And, I actually usually really enjoy maternity leave. I feel energized. I'm happy to be with the baby, but then I have to go back to work pretty quickly. And one thing that Dr. Thomas advocated for in her slides was the need for paid family leave. And I think this is some essential advocacy that we need to do in the United States. Absolutely. And then she went on to talk about sleep, which is so valued by so many families, kind of what it means to sleep through the night, how definitions vary between families, and that there's not really a sleep solution that works for every family because every baby's different, and that we don't really recommend sleep training, at least in the first 6 months or really even in the first year, and that we have to normalize infant sleep patterns, which aren't like adults, and I think that's just important to remember in counseling families. And then she kind of made a comment that it's breastfeeding on demand makes it sound like the baby itself is demanding.
I never thought of that.
But and she liked responsive feeding better, which I think is funny too. And that, the only thing that really works with breastfeeding is nipple stimulation. So you do need that even overnight when you're breastfeeding to be on a schedule. And she also kind of highlighted, too, that there's not other things that really help keep your supply up, like the lactation teas or cookies or other things that you can get. And she had this one funny slide that she said she does tell women that if they want to have cookies, to just use them as like counters for how many times to breastfeed during the day. So make a stack of 8 to 12 Oreos and just eat them after, which I might do when I'm breastfeeding my next if it works out. Yeah.
That's great. Oh, wow. So that is a perfect segue, actually, into the career transitioning I was mentioning earlier. As of January, I'll be a full-time newbornist at UNC Health Wayne. So I focused almost all my session time on newborn issues. So let's start where a lot of things end, under the diaper. Dr. Michael Ernst, with the section on urology, gave a talk on care of the uncircumcised and circumcised penis. Now, I do between 1 and 7 circumcisions a shift, but I've noticed some differences in protocol between the two hospitals where I work, so I had some questions. In fact, a lot of people had a lot of questions, and Dr. Ernst was patient in answering all of them. Overall, I found his answers reassuring. The differences I noticed between the two hospitals are inconsequential, but I did learn a couple of potential complications that I have been lucky never to have seen. One thing I'm bringing back from this talk is a checklist for which patient should be referred to urology instead of being circumcised in the newborn nursery or the clinic.
Yeah, circumcision. It's one of those things because of the protests outside the NCE that I think actually winds up on a lot of people's minds at this conference. I'm glad you got that education there. I went to another talk. This is not related to newborn care, and we can get back to that, David, too, because I know a lot of the things you went to, you said were centered on that. But I went to one entitled Male Allyship to Promote Gender Equity in Medicine. It was by a PhD, Aaron Marshall, from the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine. And I just liked it because it talked about, first of all, it defined allyship. So it said it's not just about something you think about between men and women, but you can also think about it between different groups of people by race and other things. And it's just like this idea to promote fairness and equity in the workplace and have supportive and collaborative personal relationships and public acts of sponsorship, and also advocacy to drive systemic improvement in workplace culture. And it really broke down allyship into something that's interpersonal, so showing up for people, being accountable, supporting collaboration, then publicly advocating too, which kind of goes into like holding others accountable, and then systemic changes we can make in policies and procedures to ensure equity in hiring practices and pay and other things that women have struggled with. And he talked about leaning into discomfort and talking about these difficult things. He also made a special point to talk about Black women, sometimes being the only women of color, people of color in the room, and how they have less sponsorship and advocacy than white women. So we need to be checking on their well-being. And I just really liked it because I think it ended with like, we need to hold organizations accountable, and we need to be mindful of our words and how impactful they can be and how much we can really help others around us by checking in and really having those strong, meaningful interpersonal relationships.
Wow, now you really have me thinking about whether I'm practicing allyship to the extent that I could be. So I want to go back and check that one out. Before that, though, I want to review a standing room only talk given by Drs. Jill Larson and Sonia Chaudhry on newborn and infant musculoskeletal examination and evaluation. I think I told you before that talk that if I were to give it, it would take me about 10 minutes. I'd be leaving out about 80 more minutes of critical information plus lots of questions at the end. Their presentation reaffirmed some of my practices, like referring infants at risk for congenital hip dysplasia, but who have a completely normal exam for ultrasound no earlier than 46 weeks. But it changed some other practices, like that we should really always refer newborns with brachial plexus palsy. And Dr. Chaudhry answered a question for me at the end that cleared up another difference between the two hospitals where I work. Turns out it is fine to ligate a supernumerary digit so long as the stalk isn't too broad.
Oh, we've really moved away from that and
I
thrown that
know.
to
Well, one of
plastics
my
at
hospitals
hospital,
did,
so,
and the
yeah.
other, I was actually the driving force in that. But one of the lecturers told me that if we send it to her, they will tie it off. And that if a neuroma does form, no biggie, they'll deal with that at the time. So,
Yeah, because that's always been the worry, is that you'll get a neuroma
right.
there.
It's the neuromas.
So, yeah.
While we're in the newborn nursery, I headed straight to hear Drs. Rita Dadiz and Dara Brodsky present common problems in the newborn nursery, complete with a fun quiz competition and prizes. This talk was chock full of pearls, but there was one that will absolutely change my practice. They emphasized that when we see a newborn, and you probably already know this, Joanna, because this is your life, but a newborn who's small for gestational age with no other risk factors, no maternal smoking, hypertension, placental inadequacy, substance use, we should always check for cytomegalovirus. And even at that point, treatment can make a difference for these kids. And now some places are already screening universally, but North Carolina is not one of those. So this is one that I'm going to keep in mind and at the front of my mind moving forward.
We actually are screening in Pennsylvania. We have been screening for failed hearing screens. There's a Pennsylvania law now that we have to, but we were doing that at my hospital before. And It's good that you brought that up because we also do screen when we're worried about SGA babies, specifically those who have symmetric SGA or microcephaly. And we're using saliva now, too. Now, that could be a whole talk in and of itself if you screen with urine and saliva.
I want to hear that talk. Actually.
I don't know if they went into that, but hopefully we can go into that in a podcast. We've done CMV before. So I didn't go to as many newborn talks as you, and I wanted to make my kind of last lecture, because we're actually getting to 5, be about relational health screening, because I'm really interested in that, and about relationship building from the time that you have a newborn. And there were a few sessions on this. There was one that was actually by people at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine, where I went to medical school, called Strategies to Spark Positive Parenting, Early Relational Health, and Child Development in Primary Care. And there were a lot of great videos in that are online from the Mount Sinai Parenting Center. And Dr. Blair Hammond is part of that, who is one of my mentors in medical school. Hey, Blair,
Cool.
if you're listening. And so I wanted to highlight that one, but I wanted to go into one that was entitled Relationship Health Screening and Interventions in a Busy Clinical Practice, because I thought it had some practical pearls. And it was by Dr. Rachel Gilgoff. She's a clinical and science senior advisor for UCLA and UCSF ACE's Aware Family Resilience Network. And she talked about relational health for those who are searching for a definition on that. That's sort of health and well-being and your connectedness to other people, and this opportunity to build safe, stable, nurturing relationships. You might see that as an acronym. It's really pushed as something that helps with toxic stress. And, the reason is there's biology behind it, because these relationships can actually help build your brain. Different centers in your brain can help with your cardiovascular health, your immune function, and alter hormonal release. And specifically, again, decrease stress hormones. And as we all know, ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, are not great for relationships, but these safe, stable, nurturing relationships are protective against ACEs. We even talked about this at our live podcast, David. And what this lecture was really having you do was think about screening for relationships, having open conversations about who people look to for support and who they engage with, and to really notice the strengths in people and encourage people to engage. And I thought that that was just a really beautiful message. So I encourage people to look up that lecture and other lectures on relational health.
I love this idea of screening being a positive thing. We're always looking for all these negatives. And you're like, hey, what's working great for you right now? Who loves you? Who's supporting you?
Yeah.
That's just great. So to end, I'm going to cheat a little. Since 2010, Christy and I have been attending the NCE together, which allows each of us to learn twice as much. Working in behavioral and mental health, she was especially interested to hear Dr. Beth Abel talk about marijuana and high-potency THC products, what pediatricians need to know. Honestly, as parents of a teen and young adults, I'd say we were both very interested. There were tons of takeaways about what the increased potency of THC is doing to young brains. But the biggest one for both of us was that with the prevalence of marijuana use and its potent, lasting effect on working memory, we should always be thinking about THC use when we're evaluating or treating a teen for ADHD. There's really no dose of any ADHD medication that can reverse the effects of marijuana use on cognitive function. So that's an important conversation to have with our patients when they're struggling in school.
So important because, as you mentioned, we're seeing a lot more THC use. And I think with changing laws, we're going to see more and more, especially in kids, right? And I did mention our live podcast briefly, but I just want to talk about the live podcast recording before we go.
It was fantastic. I mean, having Louis First, Alex Kemper, and Rachel Moon all on stage together, the chemistry was wonderful. The plenary, before it ran late, and I was afraid I was going to be super late, but I fast walked and we all got on the stage just in time.
I mean, it really was great, and it's definitely worth a listen. And I think I say this all the time to you, David, but I don't say it to our listeners. I really love meeting our listeners. I love when people come up to us. I love when they share what they've learned, their experiences with the podcast, how much they're actually listening to us, like how much they actually are connecting with us and the ability to make that connection. I mean, it means, honestly, the absolute world to me. And it was like so fun seeing people from last year who I know follow the podcast and like still do, and to feel like we're making those human connections. I mean, you just heard me talk about relational health. Like, it matters so much to me. So I just want to thank everyone who came to the live show. I hope you hear your energy on that podcast. It's so fun to be with you.
I know that they will. It's just permeates the whole thing. And thank you all so much.
And if you missed the conference, it's not too late again. You can always access a lot of the content online now until January 31st, 2024. Just go to aapexperience.org.
The next national conference will be September 27th to October 1st in Orlando, Florida. This was a hard decision for the Academy because of policies in Florida that discriminate against certain groups of people, including LGBTQ plus children and teens. Joanna, you said this at the plenary sessions, and I will repeat it. They are bad for children and for the pediatricians who care for them.
So we really want Florida to be another chance for advocacy, just like this conference was. In fact, our colleagues in Florida have emphasized how much this meeting means to them to support them, and we want to support the children they care for. The AAP has already come up with the theme True Colors to represent embracing all children and their care. We will use our voices to support families. So I'm gearing up for learning, joy, and maybe even some heartbreak, and I won't take for granted being able to be together again.
Oh, man, I cannot wait for next year. That's it for today's episode. If you like Pediatrics on Call, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and help spread the word. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Pediatrics on Call.
Pediatrics on Call is a production of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Our producer and editor is Ann Johnsos. Our audio engineer is Doug Nagel. Joe Puskars is our associate producer, and Susan Martin is our executive producer. Our theme music was composed by Matthew Simonson.
For more information on the National Conference and Exhibition, go to aap.org/podcast. I'm Dr. David Hill.
And I'm Dr. Joanna Parga-Belinkie. Thanks for listening.